Welcome to Wits Podcast, and it's that time of year again, Bible conference here at Hope Baptist Church in Toledo. And so it is a privilege to have Brother George live and in person. And we've had a good time this week. It's a wipeout. This is Thursday afternoon of our conference, and it's a little bit of a wipeout, but we have had a good time. George preached yesterday morning. People really enjoyed that.
Yeah.
Preached on the will of God.
Demystifying the will of God, something we've talked about on the podcast.
Yeah.
You said that's why I do those things. I had material for the message. I just turned it into a message.
No way.
Yeah, well, yeah, because you had mentioned that. Actually, that phrase, you had used it, I think, on
What
the podcast.
phrase?
Demystifying the will of God.
Oh, really?
It just stuck with me. I'm like, man, that sounds cool.
What would demystifying? Man, is there a reflection on this thing? Okay, so some of you may watch on YouTube, and that's great. Some of you listen on Spotify. But we're going to, if you want to hear the messages, I will say from the week, go to hopetoledo.org. And it's a little tricky to find, or go to livestream.com and look for Hope Toledo. And you can find multiple. But if you look on hopetoledo.org, it's a little bit difficult. Go to the archive, their media, whatever, live stream, I don't know what it's called. But if you go to the video and then click on the top right, it shows like multiple sessions, and you can click and find them that way. One of these days, we're going to update our website and make it easier for people to find stuff. But at the end of the day, we're largely a local church, so we're mostly concerned about what we're doing here and trying to get people saved. But hopefully it can be a blessing to you. Now, it is a great blessing to have Brother George here in person. Brother George, take it away.
All right, so I got to kind of just find myself here. This is the Lord driving Cain away for his sin. He tells him, and now this is verse 11. Now thou art cursed from the earth, which hath opened her mouth to receive thy brother's blood from thy hand. We talked about that. When thou tillest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto thee her strength. Fugitive and a vagabond shalt thou be in the earth. And Cain said unto the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, thou hast driven me out this day from the face of the earth, and from thy face shall I be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth. And it shall come to pass that everyone that findeth me shall slay me. And the Lord said unto him, therefore, whosoever slayeth Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark upon Cain, lest any finding him should kill him. So you already have a Bible principle there, that ground that doesn't yield crops is probably connected with a curse. That's already a principle there. And what's interesting, I learned this, I think, from Larkin, but then I did my study on it, and it sounds like they were meeting, we discussed this once, at the gate of the Garden of Eden, because he says, you've driven me from your face and from thy presence. I don't know what that verse is. Verse 14, behold, thou hast driven me out this day from the face of the earth, and from thy face shall I be hid. The Lord drive him out from his presence. And it sounds like Cain and Abel were offering sacrifice at the doors of the Garden of Eden. And so he has to go out east of the land of Nod. And then he says, I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth. And he goes on to build a city. That blows me. Verse 17, Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bare Enoch, and he builded a city. So we can talk about this. I just remembered we said we were talk about the mark of Cain last time.
Well, okay. So here's what's interesting about that to me, and this you taught me this from Scripture. I never considered it, but it says, people talk about the mark of Cain, as being black skin, being a curse, right? Well, that's not what the verse says.
No,
the Lord set a mark upon Cain, lest any finding him should kill him. The mark was actually a protection.
Right.
Not a bullseye.
Correct. And
the thing that's interesting, and I want you to talk more about that, because you being a non-white, then you can't be wrong. If I'm white, I'm definitely wrong. But being
wait, I'm kind of browner, so I can be half.
You can be half wrong.
I can be half wrong.
Yes, you can be.
It's still a safer bet than for you.
It is, for sure. I know whatever I say is wrong, but not to be too sarcastic. But the thing that you told me, lest I forget it, is that you have that mark there, and then you have Ezekiel when God says, go in and mark the ones that cry for Jerusalem, cry for the destruction of Jerusalem. Mark them. So in the Old Testament, you have this mark here. It's a mark of protection, and the mark in Ezekiel is a mark of protection.
Yeah.
So if you are a Jew that only believes the Old Testament,
right,
you are going to be surprised by the mark of the beast.
Yes.
You're deceived by it.
Well, yeah, because for you, that's going to mean protection.
Right. You're
If you
going to
reject
think,
the New
I'm
Testament revelation,
sealed.
right?
You know, they have the seal, and you're thinking that's going to protect me, and it's actually deception.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was a very surprising thing, because I thought, who in their right mind? In one sense, we know, of course, according to COVID and the vaccine and everything, people will take whatever they think is in their best interest. But because it's written there, the mark, everybody knows the mark of the beast. Like in our Western culture, mark of the beast is a thing.
Because we're looking at it from the point of view of New Testament believers, even culturally.
Mm-hmm.
But the Jew doesn't care for that New Testament. He has two references, if he even considers his Old Testament, but he has two references to a mark in his Old Testament, and they're both positive. And they're divine. I mean, God says, hey, I'm going to put a mark. So the guys not having the mark are killed by God. So it's interesting, because then that becomes the fact that the Jew rejects New Testament revelation becomes the means of his deception. Because the New Testament gives you a negative connotation to the mark. And there's a positive one with 144,000, but they reject the entire New Testament. So they're never going to believe that the mark is for their protection.
God shall send them strong delusion that they might believe a lie.
Yeah, unless they think of Hitler, but it wasn't really a mark. He put a yellow star on them. That was more just to identify them, to shame them publicly. But that mark is going to be for everybody, not just for one ethnic group. So yeah, they'll take it. They'll think it's a good thing and perish with it.
And the working of Satan with all power and signs and lying wonders. They receive not the love of the truth that they might be saved. And for this cause, God shall send them strong delusion that they should believe a lie. Yeah. Wow. So I wanted to say that, but now that we've got that.
And the whole black skin that's kind of, I mean, I believe there's some characteristics associated with the Japhethites and Hamites and Shemites. I taught that on seminary. But the connection to Cain, first, it makes no sense, because that's before the flood. Cain's line is entirely wiped out.
Mm-hmm.
We're all descendants of Noah, of the three sons of Noah now. There's nobody outside. So the Cain's bloodline is not here. Now, some people say, well, Ham's through Ham's wife. And I've heard some arguments for this, but that's speculative, A. B, you don't get your identity physically from the mother, and neither genetically nor from the Bible. You get it from the father. So the whole idea of black skin being connected to Cain is a moot point.
Mm-hmm.
And the mark of Cain communicated, it seems in the text, it seems like the idea that they will be punished sevenfold for killing him was communicated by the mark. It was communicating something. You don't look at black skin and go, oh, well, if I if I harm this fellow, I'm going to be judged 7 times. Now, there's some characteristics you can draw with certain races, including with the Jew, about being a fugitive and a vagabond, about being especially protected class despite criminal activity. There's kind of parallels to be drawn there. Cain is essentially the first. He's the prototypical victim. He plays the victim card. Like, he's guilty, but he's like, oh, but that's too much. That's too much. I can bear it.
Yeah, I remember you saying that was a really good point.
Yeah.
That's a really good point, because we do live in a world where victims are glorified.
Yeah.
And they're honored. And of course, victims have experienced something very painful, and we do not wish that on them. But in one sense, everybody is a victim of something.
Yeah.
And it is a graded scale, and some things are worse than others.
Yeah.
But the problem is, if we are in Christ, we're not victims. Here's Cain, the murderer, immediately crying wolf or crying foul. Like, he's not even considering his own sin, which shows you the depth of iniquity that we're all prone to.
Yeah.
That as soon as I can do something that destroys somebody's life, and then immediately turn around and say anybody that's become totally defensive, which is one reason probably why he was so defensive, is because he was so convicted.
Right. Yeah.
That which makes you realize, which in my mind brings up the point, when I'm so totally defensive and I have to argue for myself, there's probably a grain of truth that I'm really struggling with. I'm feeling very convicted by it. And so I'm arguing my innocence, when in reality, in my heart, I feel like I'm
if
guilty.
It's overdone, yeah. Because there's sometimes, I think we discussed this once, you need in private, like, remember Paul in Corinthians, he does defend himself in 2 Corinthians in his ministry.
Yes.
But if you overdo it and you're constantly harping on it.
Yeah, but that's in 2 Corinthians. number one, which is, I mean, and he says there, the second epistle I write to you in the first one, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, he's writing them on a regular basis, and what does he say? He just argues with questions, and not only it wasn't just, and I think there is a certain point where you have to stand and defend yourself.
Yeah.
But after you've sacrificed, like Paul has sacrificed,
right, yeah, do what he's done first,
invested in people's lives, and then, hey, listen, am not I an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus Christ, my Lord? You know, are ye not my work in the Lord? What was the word? Is it work?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah,
I think so.
So anyhow,
my labor in the Lord, and so as far as the Mark II, it would take kind of a Bible study, but I suspect, this is speculation, I think it looked like a cross.
Really?
Yeah, I think so. You know, the vengeance 77 folds. This is speculation, so granted. So I admit it when it is. But that's what we do on this show. That's what we specialize in. So
that's what we manufacture.
That's it. This Aleph Bet Gimel Dalet Hey. Well, the seventh letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Zayin, it looks like a T. You know,
I know that because of you.
There you go, with the course in the Council Might Seminary. It looks like a T, and then the letter Tau, the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and it's found throughout. The letter T is many languages. The hieroglyphic language. You're seeing the Ang, which is a cross, but the top of the cross is actually an O.
Mm-hmm.
It's an Omega and a Tau on top of each other. It's a sign of eternal life in Egyptian civilization.
Really?
Yeah. So, and then you get here on this side of the cross, and people cross themselves for protection to ward off evil. You know, so I mean, I'm summarizing kind of a long Bible study, but there seems to be some arrows pointing towards having a cross on possibly his forehead.
Well, I feel like Dr. Ruckman may have theorized about that.
Yes,
he has an X.
He says it's an X, right? Which is a cross.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, and that certainly would be. People do use a cross all the time for protection.
Yeah,
in a superstitious way, and so that'd be interesting.
There's this funny scene in I saw a movie called The Mummy. Mm-hmm. I forget which one. There's a whole bunch of movies called The Mummy. All I remember is a hilarious scene. There's this one guy. He's like this kind of sly rat kind of a character. You don't know which side he's on, you know, but he's like hanging out with the good guys, if I remember. Mm-hmm. And they're in the catacombs somewhere, and the mummy's coming, and they've awoken this ancient evil, this ancient curse, and this monster's coming to consume him. And he's got like 6-7 pendants on his neck, mm-hmm. and he's got like a cross. So he tries all the different the religious symbols to stop the mummy. He takes the Star of David, doesn't work. The mummy keeps advancing, puts out the cross, puts out like, I don't know, the Zoroastrian sign, and the mummy just kind of stops. He tries all of them, and it still kills him. He runs through all of them. I just thought that's typical superstitious.
Yes, yeah.
Well, I'm covered. I'm gonna try all of them.
Yeah, I've heard preachers do that. They'll pray and then cross themselves, and like in case they're right, you know.
Why not? What do you got to lose?
It's terrible. That's terrible. Okay, so he goes out and he builds a city. He dwelt in the land of Nod, which of course a lot of people in church dwell in the land of Nod
during the service. Yes,
it's terrible. On the east of Eden, so he's not far. And then he has a child by his wife. Okay, who was his wife?
Well, yeah, that's right. That's the kind of first question you get. I think so. Again, you know, you guys know my opinion, and again, it's speculation, but I don't think it's as crazy as any other. Is that Adam and Eve could have had children in the Garden of Eden, and they would still be subject to the curse of mortality, even if they were born after Adam consumed the fruit. That would explain why he calls Eve the mother of all living. And Adam and Eve Cain and Abel are the firstborn after the fall. But either scenario, we're not told how many years elapsed between the exile from the garden and the curse upon Cain. So in either scenario, there's enough time for Adam and Eve to have had produced multiple generations of offspring. And then Cain would have married his sister. Now here, all like the anti-biblicists jump on the train like, well, that's incest, you know. And a couple of things. First of all, the gene pool was a lot purer. What else are you going to do? But that problem exists even in the evolutionary view of life development. Even in evolution, at one point, you're going to reach two beings that are going to reproduce sexually, and there's going to be incest involved. There's going to be close kinship involved. So whether you believe in the creationist understanding, which is the truth, or the evolutionary lie, in both those scenarios, you're going to have incest.
Well, and you have obviously the prohibition against incest was how many thousands of years after this?
Correct.
In the law,
right.
which, and in other words, God, if you're going to prove that, you're going to have to say that God had a problem with that, and he did not prohibit it until the law. Then you think about Abraham, who married his half sister,
right?
And nowhere does it say God condemned him as a result of that. God allowed him to deceive people using that truth.
Yeah.
You know, he said, she is my sister. And technically she's a sister.
Right.
But, you know, she was, as far as he called her a sister, and she was, but she was his stepsister or half sister.
Yeah.
And I think in the times of those ignorance, God winked at, because you can go, you think about it, it had to have been.
Well, right. Yeah.
It had to have been. If God said, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth.
Yeah. Or if he married a niece, then it would still have been incest between his siblings to produce a niece for Cain, because he could have married a niece, but that would still be incest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I hadn't really thought about the fact that it had to have been, because of the command, be fruitful and multiply.
Yeah.
So what else are you going to do?
We're also...
Yeah. I mean, because otherwise you have to come up with another race or whatever.
Yeah, no. Death passed upon all. In Romans 5, I think Dake does something like this. If not, to Francis Dake. I think he believes in a pre-human civilization before Adam. But I've heard it theorized that there was another race of men, but that flies in the face of Romans 5. Death came upon all men through Adam.
Yes.
We only have one federal head.
Yeah. And the first, the last Adam, talks about the last Adam and the first man, Adam, it says.
Yeah.
Not just the first Adam, but the first man, Adam, it specifically says.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. I had never noticed that. Right.
Okay, so what else do we got? What do you got on the city?
I think it's
Enoch.
that. Yeah. Augustine's got an interesting comment on this. I forget what it is right now. But as far as the city, I think it's so illustrative of the rebelliousness of human nature when subject to punishment. The Lord, because this is in direct contradistinction to the Lord's judgment. The Lord's judgment is, you're going to be, in verse 12, he tells him, you're going to be a fugitive and a vagabond. Right? So Cain says, well, it's not fair. That's too much. So what does he go on and do? He builds a city. He adopts a sedentary lifestyle, which is the exact opposite of what the Lord told him he was going to be. So essentially, it's like saying, it's almost like it's like father saying, you just killed your brother, get out of here, and you're going to end up shelterless. And the son goes, oh, yeah, instead of repenting, saying, oh yeah, watch this. I'm not going to be shelterless. I'm not going to be a vagabond. I'm going to build a house. I'm going to build a city. I mean, it's like he's basically telling him, no, I'm not. I will not be fugitive and a vagabond, and I can make it on my own, and I can make it on my own outside the garden. I don't need you.
Yeah. Well, I hadn't, when you said that, it reminded me of the prodigal son, who, gathered all together, and the father divided up his living. He went out, and I was just thinking about, he wasted his substance with riotous living, and then he eventually comes back to the father. But the scripture doesn't tell us exactly what the rub was, but you have to, if that's true, what you're saying, which I think it is, then that would mean that one of the reasons why the son went and spent all his money was to prove that, you can have fun.
Right.
It's not all work all the time.
Right. Yes.
You don't have to work all the time. Yeah. You can, because I was raised by a pretty strict dad. And I remember one time we were working on July 4th, and I thought it was the greatest. July 4th, American Independence Day. It's a big holiday, patriotic. And I'm thinking, if that's that's like a sin against God to work on July 4th. And thinking how, and it wasn't like all day. It was like I had a little job to do. Right. And I remember thinking how unfair my dad was at that moment that we were doing this. And honestly, I thank God for what I considered injustices at the time, because what that does is it brings out it brings out your pride, because this wasn't just dad. It wasn't dad catching me doing something wrong.
All right,
It was
right,
me
right, right.
catching him doing
It's
something
something
wrong.
wrong.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so
Right,
then
right.
I remember having a bad attitude, and I remember thinking that this is just not fair. It's not. It ought not to be. And what it did was flush out the pride out of my heart. And I think about, here's this guy. He lives in the perfect scenario, around near the perfect scenario. Of course, after the fall, but he's near the Garden of Eden. And the Lord says, now you're just going to wander.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to wander. You're never going to settle down. And so he goes out and he proves.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
Yeah. No, I'm not.
No.
No, I'm not. And I'm going to perpetuate, I'm going to have a seed. I'm going to perpetuate my seed, and I'm going to memorialize the city on the name of the by the name of my own son. It's like he's building a dynasty. I mean, that's like everything in there is the opposite of a fugitive and a vagabond. That's
Enoch.
Yeah, Enoch.
It's not the same Enoch.
No, that's another thing. There's a lot of those names in those two genealogies there, in Genesis 5 through Seth and then through Cain, that are very similar names. And devotionally, you can say, like, basically one's real, one's a knockoff. You got two Babylons in the Bible, two Jerusalems, one's earthly in bondage, one's heavenly. Same name, but a knockoff of the real thing. Something else here I mentioned in the past, but it's such a good illustration. One day with a rabbi at night. No, I was witnessing to a young Jewish man, and he only wanted me to argue out of Genesis chapter 3 to prove the gospel. He set me that limitation in the argument. And I remember when I was talking about redemption and everything, you know what his rabbi told him? It's so illustrative, again, of like the Cain mindset of religion. His rabbi had told him the narrative, like the biblical narrative of redemption, redemption is not so much man going back into the garden, it's man bringing out the garden. It's like, basically, I don't need you to let me back in. I'm going to turn where I am into a Garden of Eden.
Really?
Yeah, just blew me away.
Huh.
The pride in that. You remember that there's a passage in Isaiah where the Lord condemns Ephraim for saying, the bricks are fallen, but we're going to build back with stone. The sycamores are cut down, but we're going to replant with cedars.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I know this is a touchy subject for Americans, but I'm just talking about, like after 2011, 2001, the Twin Towers. I remember hearing on the TV, like they destroyed the two towers, but we're going to build bigger and better.
Mm-hmm.
And that's fine. I'm glad they did. But just that notion of, do you look for repentance anywhere in this?
Right.
Or is it just like, I don't care, watch this?
Well, and that's what's so interesting, is that we can say, humility is never the right response.
Yeah.
It's never. Pride is the only response. Because what do? They hurt our pride. Never, of course, we could never say that they call us the great Satan. And the truth is, Christians don't agree with that.
Right.
But they should. In some ways. Now, I think they mischaracterize America. I think that they overlook the liberty and the freedom we have. I think there's a lot of things about America that are a lot better than that radical Islam would give us credit for.
Sure.
But at the end of the day, they're not wrong about the sin. They're not wrong about the sin. And what's the response that we have? It's, oh, we're better than you. And interesting, we don't judge it. When somebody calls us out for our sin, what do we immediately do? We begin to relativize and justify it, rather than acknowledging that it's true. Because that man who, publican, would not so lift as much as eyes of heaven, he smote on his breast, saying, God be merciful to me, a sinner. That man went down to his house justified, rather than the other, the one that said, I fast twice in a week. So the idea of going out and building the city, and now, what I was thinking when you said that, Cain had that attitude because he brought of the fruit of the ground.
Yeah.
The idea was, you kicked us out of the garden, but I can regrow it.
Yeah, you curse the ground, and I'm going to offer from the ground. It's like everything is directly rebellious. It's incredible.
Well, that thing,
and this is a religious guy. He's not an atheist.
No. You're talking about the rabbi.
Yeah, and Cain. That's Cain's religion living on. All the stuff about, we're going to make this world a better place, and don't, please, I want this world to be a better place. But this idea that I'm going to do it in my unrepentant sin without having to call on God for mercy and help, I will turn this into paradise. we will solve, like Yuval Noah Harari, the counselor to Klaus Schwab, the Jewish man, writing about we don't need God. Through technological advancements and through research, we will be able to overcome mortality. We will be able to overcome world wars. We will be able to overcome famines. We can solve these issues given enough time. We don't need this concept of God redeeming us and extending mercy. We can do it. Just give us enough time.
Yeah.
That's Cain.
Well, and what man, it's crazy that you said that about the garden. We'll grow the garden out, or what is it? We'll bring the garden to us.
Yeah,
or,
right, yeah.
Because the last mention of fruit is in Genesis 3, where the woman saw the tree was good for fruit, and hast thou eaten of the fruit of the tree, right? In chapter 3.
Yeah.
And then he brings of the fruit of the ground an offering. And it's sometimes you look at that and you say, well, why is that such a big deal? I mean, he's bringing an offering, and God, in fact, commanded offerings of grain, of meat, meat offerings.
Yeah, that's true.
So what's the big deal? He brought vegetables, but it's almost as if, I don't know, what was his mom saying? What was his dad saying to him? That's causing him to say, we can do this thing. I'll fix it, Mom. I don't know. It's speculation again, but there's something there. And so then spirit continues in killing his brother. And then when he's confronted by God about killing his brother, then like doubling down on his reputation, doubling down on his security and his name going forward. Like, I'm going to name I'm going to name the city after my son, who's going to live well past me.
Yeah.
Absalom raised a pillar in his own name.
Right.
Because he didn't have a son.
Yeah. He had actually he had 3 sons and a daughter, and it seems like the 3 sons must have died.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Because it mentions he had 3 sons. He begot 3 sons. But by the time he dies, he has no sons left. The type of the Antichrist, the Lord cuts off his seed, just like with Hitler.
Wow. Yeah. Okay, so we got through that part. And then let's go to
the first polygamist. Verse 19.
2 wives. Okay, so let's talk about that real quick. Polygamy. Polygamy is okay, right?
It's funny you mentioned that. I was thinking, this guy, I kind of super briefly pastored him in youth
like
group.
15 minutes?
Yeah, basically, because he was never really there. I think he showed up once or something. He had been part of the church, not Hope Baptist. This is another church before. And he had a certain business, and when we started Hope Baptist Church, we needed his services. He's a Christian man, and I knew his parents, so I went to him and said, hey, we want to do some flyers for the church. He said, sure, so we had a talk. He did the flyers. I went again the second time, and he was always kind of like on the edge of things. He'd like to stir the pot with doctrines and things like this. So I go into his office the second time. He says, this dispensational stuff and all that kind of stuff, New and Old Testament. So he got part of a ministry. I don't know if you heard of those guys. They're called Psalm 119 Ministries.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so they're like, they believe that you are fully under the law, and almost like Paul is a false prophet almost.
Oh, okay.
Like he perverted the words of Jesus and the law. So he was arguing with me that we are still under the law, to the point where I said, well, do you have a ribbon of blue on the 4 corners of your vesture? He said, I'm working on it.
Hey,
like that's, at least he's consistent, It's like, he's like, I'm going there, So our voice is raised. It was just, and then I had to quiet it down because it's bad testimony of the secretary outside. Because he tells me, he says, where's polygamy a sin? Can you show me in the New Testament? Like, you can't be a deacon or a pastor if you're married to 2 wives, but can you show me where it's a sin? And that's when I understood why he had become part of the 119 ministry, right? You only get the reason why people adopt certain doctrinal positions in the back end of a conversation, And once you dig, they're talking here, but the motive is over here,
Was he a polygamist?
He wanted to be.
He wanted to be.
He wanted to be. That's the idea. So basically, if you're under the Old Testament, then, God is going to wink at you having multiple wives. That was the end goal of why he wanted to be under the law.
Wow. I guess it can be, the sex drive can be a very powerful
thing. Yeah. And then a couple weeks later, it was on Facebook, and he was telling everybody I was a wolf in sheep's clothing and a false prophet and deceiver.
Because you didn't believe in polygamy?
Yeah, because we went at it about polygamy. Yeah, I mean, because I was telling him there's different.
Yeah.
We're not under the law anymore. Yeah,
Wow.
but he wanted to have multiple wives, and then and anyway, I shouldn't get there, but let me just say, like, to warn the people who might be thinking of this. He's a young man. He got married, and let's just say it didn't go well.
Mm.
You know.
Mm. Man, I'm telling you, if you okay, so polygamy. I was gonna say that God allowed polygamy. God did not condone polygamy. God never instituted polygamy, but God allowed for it. Now, there is a passage there in 2 Samuel where David he commits adultery with Bathsheba,
right.
and he and God comes back to him through Nathan and says, "Look, I gave thee thy master's wives into thy bosom."
Actively, yeah.
Yes, I gave you these things. I gave you more. Talk about that from your perspective on what does that mean? God gave him those masters' wives, and I would have given thee also such and such things.
Yeah, I don't know if you know this, but I mentioned this to show how the Bible is real to the human condition. My wife's aunt, so my mother-in-law's sister, she is married to a man who has two wives. She's the second wife.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Your wife's sister?
My wife's aunt.
Okay.
The sister of her mother. So this is in Iraq. They're Mandaeans. He married his first wife. She couldn't get any children. So then he married my mother-in-law's sister. And then he got children from her. So they are separated, like physically separated now, but they're basically both his wives still. So these things still go on. So if you're thinking, like, if people are listening to this, think, well, that stuff doesn't exist anymore. It exists. Muslims can marry up to 4. Actually, it never limits it at 4. Most Muslims think it limits it at 4, but it doesn't limit it at 4. And it happens in Montreal and here too. We got a bunch of guys. One of the ways they pay their mortgage is they'll marry multiple wives, but only one in the eyes of the government, because that's what's legal. And then the other wives register as single mothers. And then they get financial assistance, then they pool all that and give it to the man. That's how that works. So I think the Lord, actively, that's socially what was kind of acceptable. It wasn't frowned upon. And the Lord, within those social norms, under the banner of God winking at man's ignorance, participated in that. Just like with divorce, it's not as ideal, but Moses had to deal with the situation at hand. And the Lord at least structured it by allowing him to give him a bill of divorce. So it's not God's ideal. We know this because the Lord Jesus Christ in Matthew 19 makes it clear that it's not God's ideal, because the God's ideal was expressed in the Garden of Eden, one man, one woman. But it does show a flexibility as far as social contracts in the mind of God. And that's fascinating, that the Lord, as holy as he is, you could almost... He may look like a compromiser in the eyes of some men that would dare judge him, but he did allow it for a brief period of time.
Why did Moses then command to give a writing of divorcement to put her away? He saith unto them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, suffered you to put away your wives, but from the beginning was not so. That's interesting, because he says Moses allowed you to do that.
Yes, but it was confirmed by God, though. So because I got a message built on that called "Lower Your Expectations" or "Lower Your Standards." It's essentially what happens is, like, as a pastor, there's some situations you're stuck between a rock and a hard place, right? Like it's like, what God's ideal is, but there's still practical considerations. You're not a compromiser. There's practical considerations. You don't want to bust up that family. You don't want to, And it's like Moses goes back to the Lord and he says, okay, Lord, I know what you're telling me. I know what your ideal is, but, like, look at the situation. What do I do? And it's almost like Moses presents. He says, can we do this, Lord? Can we, like, at least structure it? Because they're doing it anyway, right? They're doing it anyway. Well, let's maybe structure it to at least mitigate the damage. And the Lord says, all right, Moses, they're a hard bunch to deal with. Let's do this.
Well, I just find it interesting because Jesus said, he said, you've heard in the law, but I say unto you. And here he's saying Moses suffered you. Okay. Yeah. Moses allowed you. And it reminded me of Exodus 32, where they're up, Moses receiving the law in Mount Sinai. And the Lord said unto Moses, Go get thee down, for thy people, which thou broughtest out of the land of Egypt, corrupted themselves. And
That's your,
you know what I'm saying?
that's your side of the family.
Yes, that's right.
You get this from you.
You get this from your mom. He's basically saying to Moses, you better go take care of your people down there. I don't know what they're doing, but you brought them out of Egypt. It's like, what are you saying? Moses didn't bring them out of Egypt. Moses didn't want to go to Egypt. The Lord basically brought him to a place of surrender. And I think if you haven't heard the message yesterday that he preached about demystifying the will of God, it gives you a different picture on God himself. And here's, I think, what we fail. And this is where moderation is so important in my mind. The navigating of two separate truths, right?
Which are sometimes in tension.
Right. Yeah. They in fact, moderation means you have to be in tension because you have to, maybe not always, but you have to reckon with both of those. So I think what happens is people say, well, God's flexible. That means I can do whatever he wants.
Yeah.
No.
Right. That's the other, right.
God is holier than you can even imagine.
Right.
And he's also more compassionate and gracious than you can imagine.
Right. He's trying to balance out those things. Yeah.
Which of those is more important? If you lean towards God's grace, only by, what did he say? Where sin abounded, grace did much more abound. So the only reason why you're seeking for grace is because you're leaning towards sin.
Right.
Right. But if you could also take into consideration the holiness of God, that would keep you between the lines.
Yeah, because you don't want to be leaning in towards self-righteousness either. I think sometimes we end up being more royal than God, more holy than God.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's pitfalls on either side of that. You can be going for grace because you're leaning for sin, or you can be going for the law because you're for holiness because you're leaning to look like you're better than everybody else.
Hardness, the hardness of the heart. So what does that mean? God basically set up a detour around men's hearts.
Yeah. Because
of the hardness of your hearts, I'm going to give you a way out.
Yeah. Yeah. And he did it. It's just, I mean, nobody would accuse God of being a compromiser, you know? Man. I think it's as pastors, you face situations. And that's why it blesses my heart that he says Moses gave you this precept. It sounds like Moses came up to the Lord saying he's the one that suggested this, you know? And the Lord put a stamp of approval on it because it's inspired. I mean, Deuteronomy, the passage in Deuteronomy, I think it's 24. That's given by inspiration. We believe that. And then the Lord does it. He divorces Israel. So he himself divorces Israel. Actually, he says you can't if you divorce your wife and she sleeps with another man, she can't come back and be your wife. Which in Islam, by the way, if you divorce her, she has to sleep with another man before she comes back to be your wife. The exact opposite.
Really?
Yes. She has to be defiled before you can take her back. Right? Yeah. So, but then the Lord tells Jerusalem, he says, I know that, you know, basically the law says if you sleep with another man, you can't come back to your original husband. You've slept with a whole bunch, and I still want you to come back to me. You know, there's passages I feel like I'm not old enough to even start to comment on, you know?
Yeah. I mean, if you're wondering about that, Jeremiah 3:8. And I saw when for all the causes whereby backsliding Israel committed adultery, I had put her away and given her a bill of divorce.
Yeah, so he does his own. It blows my mind, man.
Here's the thing about God. You think I know about God. You don't know about God. You know the concept of God. But God bends over backwards and lets people walk all over him. And that's the same God that the blood is going to be up to the horses' bridles in Revelation. Right. It's both sides. And so what we need to do is reckon, okay, God, he cares enough about me. He doesn't want me to sin. But if any man sin, we have an advocate with the Father. Yeah. Right. And so if we can, and I think this is probably a good place to it's a shorter podcast today, but because of the conference, but maybe if I could encourage you with anything, it would be, here's Cain. Cain murdered his brother, and then God has a conversation with him and tries to help him.
Yeah.
After that.
That's mind-blowing.
You know, and then Cain, what does he do? He goes on and his merry way, complains and whines and just keeps going, almost like Jonah.
Yeah.
After Jonah's rebellion, God has a conversation with him.
And he passes those characteristics down the generations. Lamech is a descendant of Cain. And, we didn't go on to read it, but he had murdered a young man too. And he says, God's going to avenge Cain 7 times, my great-grandfather, whatever he was. He's going to avenge me 77 times. He's got such an inflated sense of worth, this guy. It's in the bloodline,
It's so important how we choose to react to what God does. Because it's generational.
It is. Polygamy and murder together. I let a Muslim guy from Ghana once. His father was a cleric in Africa. He said he had 4 wives. His father had 4 wives. And now he's telling me this. He's pouring out his heart. This young man, he says, it's the worst thing in the world. He says the other wives would try to poison the children of the other wives.
Oh, my soul.
Because his dad was a rich cleric in Ghana. He says, because they want the inheritance for their kids. So he says, we could never trust the moms of our half brothers and sisters. Like if there was food, we just think. That's the kind of mess you get into. It's vile.
Yeah, for where envy and strife is, there's confusion and every evil work.
Yeah. I know the flesh kind of, there's something appealing in it to man's flesh. But, I got 2 daughters. Okay. Think of it this way. Like I measure it on myself. Like I would just half about lose my mind. I would never over my dead body have one of my daughters married to a guy who has another wife.
The only way you can make it work really is to spiritualize it. That's what Joseph Smith did. Do you know that's another thing? That's polygamy.
Mormonism.
Yeah. Because you brought the connection I'd never seen between Islam and Mormonism, and you had the theory that maybe it's the same angel that talked with Muhammad, and I don't know. Did you say that?
I think so, but it's basically Muslim repackaged, Islam repackaged for the Western Japhethite. Yeah.
Oh my soul.
I think that angel went to, watch this, guys. I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to Americanize it.
Yeah, exactly. They're like, ain't going to work. They have the Bible there. He's like, no, watch this. Yeah, and that is what it is. Where envy and strife is, and if you back that train up, you're talking about he killed his brother, right? Had to be some envy involved in that.
Yeah.
And that strife produced all of the stuff, moving forward that ended up destroying everything that we think is beautiful. It was the sin in the heart that started. And you think about what would life have been like if Cain had not killed Abel. And they talk about a godly line and which I don't believe in that, but that concept would have been there possibly. Now we know that he was sinful as well, but what would the generational effect have been like in Abel's life if his kids and grandkids grown up with cousins across the river and they're over there building a city and they're over there marrying multiple wives and see the distinction in Abel's life, that I just think that would have been fascinating. But then the truth is we have opportunity to see it today.
Yeah.
Somebody stays humble before the Lord, tries to follow God, tries to live a clean life in the sight of God, and you watch the generational effect that it has.
Yeah.
Your parents aren't perfect, but...
Oh, I was telling Sally, coming here, seeing so many families blessed over generations with there is something that gets passed on.
Mm-hmm.
There really is. There is a godly heritage, and it's easier to see for those of us who are like only 2nd generation Christians or 1st generation Christians. You see it. Mm-hmm. There's a blessing that comes with multiple generations of Christianity.
Yeah, a lot of that work is done. It's like a field that's already been plowed, and this area here used to be a forest, thick forest. They say you could not see the sun at midday because it was so thick. And over the years, 150, 175 years ago, people cleared out all the trees, blew all the stumps, drained the swamp, and now we are recipient of, people think of Ohio as flat because they see so much farmland.
Right, that's how I think of Ohio.
All that farmland was completely covered in forests.
Really?
Mm-hmm. And because of the work of generations, clearing out all those trees, and then clearing out all the rocks and making it conducive to growing things, and that's what generational godliness can do.
Sure.
Every generation has to be saved, born again, but the habits and the customs and the traditions can really encourage and help Christian growth.
Yeah, and if you're a 1st generation Christian, I liked what Pastor Beecher, is he pastor?
Yeah.
Yeah, he said this morning he was born in a non-Christian home. He kind of envied being born in a Christian home, but he was born in a good home.
Good home.
And he was thankful for that because there's advantages on both sides.
Yes. Well, the truth is God knows where we are. and we have to accept where we are
Yeah.
and bloom where we're planted.
Well, you could be the head of a generational.
Exactly.
That's a great honor. You're like the founder of this.
I love it.
Yeah.
Well, okay, guys, this has been a little short time frame. We still got to get to that email. We're going to get to that email next time. But if you want to email us, you can at witsend@gmail.com and witsendguys@gmail.com. Love to hear from you. Anything you want to say before we close?
Yeah. Don't marry more than one wife.
Amen.
Think of your sisters and your daughters, guys. Come on. Use your head.
And don't marry
moms.
more than one wife at a time, or don't think you can do it one at a time.
Right.
Right? So stop flirting with everybody on the planet.
It's wrong. It's a sin. There's no way out.
Yes. Just humble yourself and wait on the Lord. All right, guys, we love you, and we'll catch you next time around.
God bless you guys.